se levanta un pueblo entero lleno de angustia, luchando por su digna patria, lograda con el coraje, desgarrando cada día con sus principios éticos.
US-based terrorism against the people of Cuba, which to this date has caused the death of 3,478 people and permanent injury to thousands more. Thank you, sisters and brothers, for coming here. We have the picket signs. Please pick them up. My name is Murtaza Gobzadeh. I'm with Toronto Forum on Cuba, a member organization of Latin American and Caribbean Solidarity Network. And next to me is
Julio Fonseca. I represent the Association of Cubans in Toronto, and we have organized this rally together with the Toronto Forum on Cuba and other solidarity organizations in Toronto on defense of the Cuban Five. We are here in front of the U.S. consulate to demand to free the Cuban Five immediately. They were not spies. They were in the States preventing terrorist attacks against Cuba. Cuba does not sponsor terrorism. We urge the government of the United States to take Cuba out of that list of terrorist-sponsored countries. We demand that the United States of America close the torture center in Guantanamo and return this land to its rightful owner, the people of Cuba. We want to thank you for being here with us, for being a voice for the Cuban Five. Thank you very much.
Yeah, among the endorsers of this rally today are Canadian-Cuban Friendship Association Toronto, Friends of the Cuban Five in Toronto, International Festival of Poetry of Resistance, Worker to Worker Canada-Cuba Labor Solidarity Network, LGBT Sea of Red, Jewish People's Order of Canada in Canada. So we thank all the endorsing organizers. And what we're going to do in this format, we're going to go around in a circle with our chants in solidarity with the Cuban Five. Please pick up the picket signs. We have some more over here. And then we're going to have some of the invited guests to update us on the case of the Cuban Five. Because, as I mentioned earlier, today is part of an International Day of Solidarity with the Cuban Five. At this moment of time, also in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House, representatives from 20 countries are taking part in activities to denounce the detention of the free the Five, free the Cuban Five. 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 Free the Five, free the Five now! Free the Five, free the Cuban Five! 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 What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the Five.
When do we want it?
Now.
Free the Five, free the Cuban Five.
Free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free the Five. Free the Cuban 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 Free the five.
Free the five. Jail Posada. Free the five.
Jail Posada.
Free the five.
Jail Posada.
Free the five.
Jail Posada.
Luis Posada Carreras is the mastermind of the first civilian airliner blow-up in midair in 1976, when 73 people died on board. Luis Posada Carreras also the mastermind of terrorist bombings in Havana Hotel in the 90s, but in 1997, Fabio De Charlo, Italian Canadian resident of Montreal, was killed. Shame on U.S. government!
Shame.
Why anti-terrorist Cubans behind bars? So we demand. What do we want? Free the five. When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Free the five.
When do we want it?
Now.
Free the five! Free the five!
Free
I
the
say Cuban
five.
Five. You say freedom now. Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Cuban Five.
Free them now.
Free the five.
Free the Cuban Five!
Free
the five! Free the Cuban Five!
Cuban Five.
Free the five! Free the Cuban Five!
Free the five.
Free the five. Free the Cuban Five.
Free the Cuban Five. Free the five.
Free the Cuban Five.
Free the five.
Free the Cuban Five.
Free the five.
Free the Cuban Five.
Free the five.
Free the Cuban Five.
Free the five! Free the Cuban Five!
Free the five. Free the Cuban Five.
Manina from the Latin American and Caribbean Latin American Solidarity Network.
That's the Latin American and Caribbean Solidarity Network. We bring greetings, and we just want to add our voices to demanding that the Cuban Five get freedom. We do stand behind, the movement. We do believe that there is injustice when it comes to having the Cuban Five in prison with absolutely no reason at all, when there has been no justice observed throughout the many years that they have been in prison, that they have been barred from having support, from their families, that they have not been able to see their families and connect with their families. So we stand strong behind the, denouncing the Cuban Fives being in prison, and we demand freedom. So free the Cuban Five.
Free the five. Free the Cuban Five.
Free the five. Free the Cuban Five.
Next with us is Pablo Vivanco from the
Good afternoon,
Avanzada
comrades.
Bolivariana.
My name is Paulo Ivanco. I'm going to be just speaking about, as Morteza said, I'm representing here the Avanzada Bolivariana, which is a coalition which started about a couple years ago to defend another important revolutionary process, that of Venezuela, which obviously over the last couple months, I'm sure many of you are aware of what Venezuela's been going through with a renewed offensive on the part of the Venezuelan ruling class supported by U.S. imperialism. I just came back from Brazil last week, where there was the first meeting, continental meeting of social movements of the Americas towards ALBA. So some of you may be familiar with the Bolivarian Alliance for Ahora America, which was a project initiated by Comandante Chavez and ex-Presidente Castro to try to integrate the countries of Latin America under economies based on solidarity, on trade based on solidarity. However, there's also an integration that's being pushed forward by the social movements. The number of countries that aren't part of ALBA at this point, but the social movements in those places, like many of us, pertain to social movements here, right? But we probably aren't going to be becoming part of ALBA as a country anytime soon. Still, there's an importance for our movements over here to integrate ourselves, to start working together with other movements elsewhere, and obviously in the continent. That assembly, one of the, among the resolutions that were passed was to support this day of action in support of the Cuban Five, which also June 1st, I should tell you, is another day of action that was being organized in other parts against the occupation in Haiti. So there's some things that are going to be coming down over the next little while. That assembly also ended up approving essentially a continental structure for social movements to start integrating themselves. So we're going to be doing a report back on that so that hopefully whatever organizations that you're a part of can become integrated into that process, that us as movements, people that are involved in trying to transform our society here, can start working in tandem with our brothers and sisters in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and all throughout the hemisphere to not only oppose U.S. imperialism, but to start constructing alternatives to neoliberalism, to capitalism. All right, so thank you very much, and free the Cuban Five.
Free the Five!
Thank you, Pablo. Pablo Vivanco. Also, I would like you to know that there are 2 new booklets on the case of the Cuban Five, except the fact that Rene Gonzalez, after renouncing his U.S. citizenship in early May, now he's back in Cuba. Otherwise, if you want to learn about the case of the Cuban Five, we want to convince our friends and others about the case of the Cuban Five and why fighting for the Cuban Five is fighting for our freedom, please get these booklets from us. We have them now in English and Spanish. Next in line is Elizabeth Hill, president of the Canadian-Cuban Friendship Association, Toronto.
Thank you, Morteza. I am so happy to be here. Right here, there's no better place to be today except in front of the U.S. consulate, supporting the Washington demonstration today in support of the Cuban Five. 5 days for the Five. Thank you, Morteza, for taking the initiative for getting this started, and that all the groups could join in. Today there are demonstrations in many countries, as well as 22 different countries represented at the 5 days for the Five in Washington. There's a demonstration in Vancouver today. There's one in Montreal. There's one in Ottawa, and here we are in Toronto. There will be another one in Vancouver on the 5th of the month. So all of this is part of the worldwide movement in support of the Five to put political pressure on the U.S. government to do what is right, what should have been done long ago. I'm also part of the Canadian Network on Cuba, which met last 2 weeks ago and has organizations across the country. So we're solidly behind it, and we sent a message and a donation to Washington for the 5 days for the Five. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and keep up the work. I think this year can be a very strong year for the Five, and free the Cuban Five. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth Hill. Thank you.
Free the Five.
Also, we have a good friend of Cuba and a good friend of the anti-terrorist Cuban 5, Nekama Miller from Cabildo Manuelita Sáenz. Please, welcome, Nekama.
Welcome, comrades and friends, compañeros. This is a very important struggle. Freeing the Cuban Five would be one of the first steps, most important steps that the United States can make towards alleviating the chasm that lies between Cuba, such a wonderful nation that has struggled for the poor, the disadvantaged. But in the meantime, I want to call for the visitation rights of Adriana. This is also a woman's struggle. Women who have been deprived of all other rights that other women have to visit their husbands in prison. We should not forget the strong women that have supported their husbands, of the Cuban Five, and how difficult it has been for them. I call to the attention of the United States government, to President Obama, to keep his word on other issues with relation to Cuba. For example, closing Gitmo. It's about time. Woo! And so we stand here in this territory, strong and free and full of our hope for our generations to come. We are working for peace, and so that my grandchildren, your children can see peace in the Caribbean and see that Cuba gets taken off the terrorist list that the United States has made up, whereas it has within its own frontiers has greater problems. I would say clean up your house first and then start up with others that you don't have any business attacking. So keep your hands off of Cuba. Free the people who were never attacking there. They were just defending the rights of Cuba. They were just looking out for their interests in peace. The 5 prisoners in U.S., or the 4 prisoners right now in U.S. jails, were men of peace. They were not carrying bombs. They were not attacking anybody. So we have to remind the United States that to what extent have they gone to hurt a nation that has been so courageous and has been the beam of hope for Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Negama. Thank you. Yes, isn't that sad and outrageous to know that Luis Posada Carriles, a self-confessed, convicted terrorist, is walking a free man in the streets of Miami, and then Cuban Five behind bars for fighting US-sponsored terrorism. Luis Posada Carriles' last act of terrorism was in 2000, where among with his buddies, with his cronies, 4 others were arrested in Panama with 30 pounds of C4 explosives, where they were planning to blow up University of Panama, where Fidel Castro was going to deliver a speech to university students of Panama. He was convicted, he was put in jail. Then outgoing president of Panama, against the Constitution of Panama, Moscoso, released Posada, pardoned Posada, and where did she go back to? She went back to Miami, and 3 years later, Posada Carriles did stick back to his community of terrorists and violent organizations in Miami. As we speak, terrorist organizations like Omega 7, Commandos F4, are doing paramilitary training with the statements to the media that we want to go and bring about change in Cuba with their terrorist activities. And then the US government has the gall to put the Cuban government on the list of countries supporting terrorism. What a shame. What a shame. What a shame. So next in line, I would like to ask Linda Mestenheimer from the Toronto Friends of the Cuban Five. Please.
Thank you, Morteza, and thank you to everyone for coming out today. I think the many of you are already familiar with the frame-up of the Cuban Five on charges of conspiracy to commit espionage. These, as we know, were charges that had absolutely no basis in fact, and as others have said, their mission was simply to prevent terrorism against Cuba. But in my comments today, I really want to focus on the additional frame-up against one of the Cuban Five, their leader, Gerardo Hernandez. Now, Gerardo is the member of the Cuban Five that has the longest sentence. In fact, if the U.S. had his way, Gerardo will never come out of prison because he was jailed and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison plus 15 years. I think it is very important that we all become very familiar with the particular frame-up that was used against Gerardo, because it really explains what we are still up against with 4 Cubans still behind bars, and the need to apply, as Gerardo's wife, Adriana Perez, explained to us in Toronto in late April. She said it will take enormous political pressure on President Obama in the United States to force him, to compel him to set the Cuban Five free. It is political pressure that needs to be built, that needs to be expanded. That means we have to build a larger and stronger movement. So what happened with Gerardo? How is it that he was framed up on an additional charge of conspiracy to commit murder? Now, I know this was not a charge of murder. It was a charge of conspiracy, because in fact there was no murder. So let me explain what happened. In 1996, the Cuban government took a decision after every attempt to avoid doing so, to shoot down 2 small airplanes that had many times overflown Cuban territory and Cuban waters. In a number of cases, they dropped propaganda and other materials on Cuban soil. This, of course, was a threat to Cuba and a violation of its sovereignty, something that Cuba has endured ever since the Cuban people overthrew the Batista dictatorship. Cuba finally reached the point it was no longer prepared to tolerate this, and it set out to speak with the authorities at every level of the United States government, and also with civil agencies such as the federal aviation authorities in the U.S. and the international aviation authorities, pleading at all these levels for a stop to be put to these overflights by Brothers to the Rescue, which claimed to be a humanitarian organization, but in fact was doing regular spying and actively hostile actions against Cuba. The leader of Brothers to the Rescue was a former CIA leader, which is actually true for most of the terrorist groups that function with impunity in Miami. So the U.S. basically engaged in a conspiracy to allow Cuba, to force Cuba to carry out the only alternative it had left, despite all, and in the face of all of the warnings, including to the pilots themselves. And ultimately, Cuba shot down most planes because, once again, their warnings were overlooked. This was not a crime. This was simply the Cuban government exercising its rightful sovereignty after making every attempt to prevent this necessity. The U.S. knew that this was going to happen. They were part of a conspiracy, in fact, to ensure that it did happen, despite all their words to the contrary. None of us can believe that the U.S. was not capable of stopping illegal flights over Cuban territory. Of course they can do that. And we can recall now that since 9/11, the U.S. has said that it would be prepared to shoot down passenger planes that have been hijacked by terrorists. So this tells you, just exactly to what extent they really knew what was going on all along. So because the prosecution tried to label this act a crime, and because the prosecution of the Cuban Five was not going very well in the courts, to the point that El Nuevo Herald, which is the sister Spanish language newspaper to the Miami Herald, complained that instead what was happening in the courtroom was that it was the Cuban exile community that was being put on trial by the Cuban Five and their legal defense. So the terrorist groups were very nervous that they would not get these strong, long prison sentences that their community, was dearly hoping for, and that the U.S. also wanted. And so therefore they decided that they had to find a way to link Gerardo to the shoot down of these planes over Cuban waters. And that is, you know, years after the event, and knowing all of the facts for many years as to what had happened, they nevertheless decided to put forward the big lie, the story that Gerardo was involved in collaborating with Cuba and communicating with Cuba about this and was therefore an accessory to murder. So there was no murder, but of course that was not a problem for the U.S. prosecution either. What they decided was that they would make a case, in fact, that it was murder. They prevented the defense of Gerardo from obtaining the satellite data that the United States has, you know, as part of its military operations that could identify exactly where those planes were shot down. And the U.S. has blocked every effort many times over to get that satellite data released. Now, Cuba has its own radar data, which clearly shows that the planes were shot down in Cuban waters. We are acting at the same time as Cuba activists defending the Cuban Five worldwide and especially in Washington right now. One of the things we're asking you to do as soon as you can, and no later than this coming Wednesday, June 5th, is to send a message to President Obama demanding immediate freedom for the Cuban Five. We want to add our voices to the protests that are happening in the United States that are uniting so many fighters.
Next we have Francisco Suarez from Louisville, Bolivarian Sica. Please get your hands together for Francisco.
Viva Francisco!
Thank you for being here, supporting this struggle in order to denounce worldwide how an injustice process, a violation of all legal judiciary system in the U.S. has been implemented in order to keep 5 Cuban patriots, 5 Cuban peace people who went to the U.S. to try to prevent the U.S. Violent actions against a whole nation. That nation, Cuba, has shown to the whole world that Cuban people, Cuban as a nation, as its government, had been provided to the whole world not only medical assistance, educational assistance, and many other supports, but had been also showing to the whole world that peace could be built. And while they were doing so, these 5 patriots in the US, they were just unjustifiably arrested and convicted in a very, I will say, mockery type of judicial process. I am here on behalf of the Luis Riel Committee, Círculo Bolivariano Luis Riel here in Toronto, to support not only the denouncement of this particular injustice, another injustice on the hands of the US, but also to call all of you to try to continue building bridges in order to support every day not only the fight to free the Cuban Five, but also to continue denouncing all the atrocities the U.S. government has committed, not only against these 5 pacifist and courageous soldiers of the Cuban people, but also the crimes that the U.S. government has committed against the Cuban people as a whole. We have to remember that from the White House, from the Pentagon, from the CIA, there have been orders, there have been programs, there have been people trained and people supplied with weapons and murder methods to go to Cuba, to insult, to sabotage, to provoke, to dislodge the Cuban process. And that is an action that has been implemented by the U.S. government since too many years ago. We have in mind not only Bahia Cochinos, Bay of Pig action. We have in mind not only the actions that others in here in this mic have already denounced, but we also know that through many different ways, those bands of criminals that reside or live in Miami and in other places, among them Posada Carriles, very well-known terrorists, and many others in Miami and in Florida at large, had been operating with free hands, had been supplied by the U.S. government as such. And there is no point to accept that a government who proclaims itself a democratic government, as the US government proclaims itself, continue supporting those actions that violate international law, actions that put at risk a whole nation, the nation of Cuba, actions that put at risk other nations in the world. So I am here denouncing all of those criminal terrorist actions that the US government has carried out, and I am here to say, we from many lands in the world, we from many countries in the world, we from many peoples in the world are here in Toronto to denounce those actions and to call now President Obama to be honest, to be a real man, and to stand for freedom and for liberty, and to free immediately the Cuban Five. And I also call all of you to continue building bridges in order to build up a powerful solidarity movement that could denounce not only these crimes, but also could prevent other crimes. Yes, compañeras and compañeros. Yes, comrades and friends over here. We can prevent other crimes. Yes, because we have eyes, we have ears, and we have knowledge, and we could see clearly when somebody is trying either to sabotage or to dislodge or to build up lies against process like the Cuban process, or building lies against these Cuban Five heroes. I also call all of you in order to support not only the Cuban Five, the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban leadership, but also to support other Latin American movements like the Venezuelan Bolivarian process too. And I am here to say, free the Cuban Five! Free the Cuban Five!
Free the Cuban
Next
Five!
and last, I believe we're going to have Juan Carranza, attorney at law, who is going to let us know about the latest challenges in court facing the Cuban Five, or I must say facing the US government after they paid journalists against the law. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mustafa, and that's exactly where the legal case is right now, where the defense of the Five, the legal team defending the Five, has brought a motion, an application for habeas corpus, and as part of that motion, they have filed documentary evidence that unequivocally demonstrates that the government of the United States was paying journalists at the time of the trial, at the time of the lengthiest trial in the history of the United States at the time. They were paying journalists to influence public opinion. They were paying journalists to inflame the jury in Miami, the potential jurors of Miami, so that a conviction would be guaranteed. And this is extremely, extremely shameful. There is no way that that can be justified in any democratic society. The United States government now is in the position to have to release the thousands of documents that will demonstrate the full extent of this campaign, of this real conspiracy to subvert the legal system in the United States to secure a conviction, an unjust conviction that has led to the incarceration of the Five for almost 15 years. This is extremely shameful, and we must insist on the liberty, freedom of the Cuban Five immediately. There is no sense, there is no justification for the continued incarceration of the Four, and we must demand freedom for the Five now. Free the Five! Free the Five! Free the Cuban Five! Free the Five! Free the Five! Free the Cuban Five! Free the Five! Free the Five! Free the Cuban Five! Thank you.
USA! Shame, shame, USA! Shame, shame!
USA!
Shame, shame! What do we want?
Free the Five!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Free the Five!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Free the Five!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Free the Five!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Free the Five!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Free the Five! Now! Free the Five! Now! Cuban Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free, free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. What do we want? Free the Five. What do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. What do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. What do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. What do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. Shane, Shane, USA. Shane, Shane, USA. Shane, Shane, USA. Shane, Shane, USA. Free the Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free, free, free the Five. Free the Five now. Free the Five. Free the Five now. Free the Five. The Cuban Five. Free the Cuban Five. Free the Five. Free the Cuban Five. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Free the Five. When do we want it? Now. What do we want?
Sisters and brothers, thank you very much for coming out today. Please stay tuned. We're going to have more activities. We're going to finish it off with a song for the Cuban Five.
Se levanta un pueblo entero lleno de angustia, luchando por su digna patria, lograda con el coraje, desgarrando cada día con sus principios éticos el vil imperio, su adversario político, que siempre ha combinado el engaño con la ignorancia para darse a conocer a toda voz. Pero el mundo conoce su verdadero rostro, porque cuando un pueblo enérgico y viril llora, la injusticia tiembla. Se levanta un pueblo entero lleno de angustia, luchando por su digna patria, lograda con el coraje, desgarrando cada día con sus principios éticos el vil imperio, su adversario político, que siempre ha combinado el engaño con la ignorancia para darse a conocer a toda voz. Pero el mundo conoce su verdadero rostro, porque cuando un pueblo enérgico y viril llora, la injusticia tiembla.
Llora un pueblo y muchos más por una injusta causa que será juzgada por el mundo hasta el final. Cuando se le declare libertad, son 5 héroes condenados están en un imperio donde no hay piedad. Sé que algún día pronto llegará, juntos gritemos pronto volverá. Diciendo tiempo al tiempo hasta vencer.